Okay, Jyoti, Ben, you are on.
Currently, about 300 million people practice yoga all over the world, crafting themselves into a perfect piece of art. What a captivating description of yoga by Dr. Jessica Frazier. I'm Jyoti Patel, and it gives me immense pleasure today to introduce you to Dr. Frazier, whose talk promises to be fascinating an exploration of yoga from the artistic perspective. It was at the tender age of 13 that Dr. Frazier expressed an interest to her parents about learning Sanskrit. I think her interest was sparked after she picked up a copy of the Upanishads from her parents' library. She went on to collect, seemingly very effortlessly, degrees in Sanskrit, in religious studies, and the philosophy of religion from Oxford and Cambridge universities. She's a fellow of the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies and a lecturer in the theology of religion at Trinity College in Oxford. She has written several books, including The Hindu Worldviews and the Bloomsbury Companion to Hindu Studies, and has numerous publications to her name. Her research interests are in phenomenology and philosophy. Not only that, but she is the managing editor of the Journal of Hindu Studies, and which is published by the Oxford University Press, and finds time to be a consultant and speaker for the BBC quite often. So to help us gain a deeper understanding and appreciation of yoga, everyone please welcome Dr. Jessica Frazier.
Wonderful. Shall I take over from here? Fabulous.
Thank you, Dr. Frazier. Yes, please do.
Thank you. First of all, it's so nice to be with all of you. I'm really touched that everyone is here. And it's lovely to be in a space with so many people who, some of whom I've met, some of whom I haven't met, but we kind of get to be together in one place, even though we're in such different places. So hello to everyone. And it's lovely to be in a space, as it were, with you all. And I'm impressed that you're all taking time for this on a beautiful day. It's actually really lovely that you're all here to talk about and sort of discuss this topic with me. So thank you very much for the invitation from the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies Friends Group. And what I want to do today is talk about yoga, and I really want to talk about it from the perspective of a kind of a realization I came to when I had been doing, my specialism is in Vedanta. I'm interested in the nature of the self, Atman, in the nature of Brahman, and I always kind of would tiptoe around the area of yoga studies. There's many great scholars, there are many great practitioners. It's such an ancient and powerful tradition. And when I finally ended up going and working on yoga in the Yoga Sutras and in the texts beyond it, you know, there's always, in Hinduism, it's like a flower. There's a core, but there are petals that go outwards into many different eras, many different parts of Hindu tradition and many different texts. I discovered some things that were not what I expected. I had a surprise in many ways. And a lot of the goals that I thought were the goals of yoga were actually part of a much wider range. So the first thing I'm going to do before I really start my talk is ask everybody, what do you think the goals of yoga are? And if you think about it in your own mind, if you have particular thoughts about what you feel it should be or what you've assumed it is, great. And in fact, if you want to put down a word, or just one word or one phrase in the chat box for the Zoom, then go ahead and do that. And I'll come back and look at your suggestions later when we try and answer this question, right? So what are the goals of yoga? And to tell that story, to try and do the kind of detective work, to find out what in this vast, incredible forest of what the Hindu tradition is through its history, what the different goals have been, I want to look at a couple of different texts and parts of the history that people don't always explore. And I want to jump sideways into neuroscience, which I had to do some research on in order to find a perspective on this that made sense of what the texts were telling me. And then we want to jump back into what I hope is for me, it was an unusual way of looking at what yoga really involves. Wonderful, we're getting ideas coming in already. This is fabulous. So I'll come back to your ideas shortly. So let me start by sharing my screen and just going through a couple of things. So if we go back to the beginning, oops, screen sharing, great. And I think here we are. So what is the goal of yoga? Already you guys are engaged in trying to put together, as it were, a portfolio of the different ideas. And to me, this is an important question. One of the first things I ever did to really teach yoga, not the practice, but the history, the scholarly perspective on it, was to go and teach to a large group of practitioners in London. And I got there, and they all had their own idea of what yoga was about and what the ultimate goal was. And the thing that was surprising was that it was very diverse. People had different ideas about it, right? So it led me to ask, what is the goal of yoga after all? It's become perhaps the most internationally widespread spiritual practices. As you know, like the Vatican, the Pope produced a document explaining what he thought yoga was and what he thought how it could integrate into Christianity. It's an important part of Islamic practice in a lot of the traditions of Islam that became associated with, linked and interacting with Hinduism. It's become, of course, it's spread across Buddhism, and that means the whole of Asia. It's the biggest global practice, I think, that we've possibly ever had in history. And yet there's a big fight at the moment about what yoga is really for. In fact, there's some major international institutions, some of the richest research institutions in the world have set up huge projects, getting scholars together to debate what the goals of yoga are. And this is prompted by the fact that yoga has become a hugely, as you know, it's a very lucrative industry. And things like the mindfulness app, which is in many ways a wonderful thing. It's been integrated into therapy, into sort of medical practice. But it's also, of course, the mindfulness app is also a huge business. And in fact, at one point, a number of scholars in Oxford were approached by businesses saying, can you help us develop new apps that will make us more money off of this ancient tradition? So that made me think even more intensely about what the goals of yoga are really supposed to be, and if there's anything which in a sense takes us away from that. So I'll be interested to see what your answers are. To put this into perspective, India has many classical spiritual philosophies, as you know, right? And these are just the Sad Darshanas, the six darshanas, the six philosophies that were prominent in ancient India. Yoga, of course, is one. And the classical text, the Yoga Sutra, of course, says the goal is Nirodha, right, or Samadhi. Nirodha, literally the ceasing of things. We'll come back to this idea. Samadhi, a complete immersion in a pure and still state of mind. Samkhya, you get a similar idea, but always a little bit different when you look at each school of thought. Samkhya, which was associated with yoga, one of the great ancient schools, very influential in the Gita, of course, it said the ultimate goal is kaivalya, right? Where kaivalya literally, from the Sanskrit kevala, means alone, pure, solitary, untainted by anything of the world. By Sheshika, one of the less well-known schools, but hugely important, kind of looked at the world in terms of atoms that were put together by God in a certain way. They called the ultimate goal apavarga. And their sister school, Nyaya, school of logic, called it nishreyasa. And apavarga and nishreyasa, both similar, they were so intent on the idea that the ultimate goal was a complete calm stillness that they actually saw the soul in its ultimate goal as not conscious at all, insentient, like a stone. They literally say, if you achieve the ultimate goal, you're like a stone. This is very different from Mimamsa, which of course comes out of the Vedas, and that says the ultimate goal is dharma. They actually just see action, good action, doing the ritual, helping the world to turn over in its proper order. That's the ultimate goal. So very different from being still and unconscious like a stone. And Vedanta, of course, is the tradition that, arguably with yoga, with Sankhya, has had the most influence on Indian history. That is the school that leaned into this term that I think we know, moksha. where moksha could mean many things, but it always meant some kind of union with the divine. So we have a range of different ancient philosophies, and they have similar but not always the same goals. So actually, I want to look at yoga as a kind of a puzzle. Scholars who are working on the sources of it, if you try and trace back the thread to the first hints of yoga in ancient Indian history, it's actually interesting that you find, like a tree, many roots and not just one. There's what we call proto-yoga, like early yoga, before it even was called yoga, but they're using the same techniques, or they have some of the same ideas, or some of the same lifestyles. So the many roots of the tree that become yoga include some that you may well know, right? So in the Rigveda, so we're looking at texts that are written in, I don't know, probably 1200, or they're written down in 1200 or 1000 BCE. So 3,000 years ago. It describes in the hymn of the Kashins, I think it's Rigveda 10:136, it talks about the Kashins as these mysterious characters who have powers, who fly with the gods, who can literally fly, who drink soma, who have special energy. Interesting to think they don't mention the word yoga, but some of it sounds like yogis. You've got characters called the Vratyas in another hymn of the Vratyas. And the Vratyas, they do vrats, so they take a kind of a vow. They seem to be ascetics, so they do tapas. They withhold and restrain and sort of control themselves. And the Vratyas seem to have almost a warrior side to themselves. It's like the warrior ascetic. They have powers, they have energies, they have siddhis. They're stronger than other people. You also, of course, probably another source of what yoga originally was, you get all the way back to the first rishis. The way that rishis are described in the Vedas, they're seers, they can see into reality, they're philosophers, they can use their mind almost like a super tool, a magical power to comprehend the universe. These days, if you sit around thinking about the nature of reality, it's just people think that you're just doing some funny little activity. Then that was seen as like a vision, a deep and powerful, profound and beautiful vision that affects you and affects the whole world. So this yogic ability to see into reality, starting in the Vedas, is probably another root. That's 1, 2, 3 roots. You also get possibly one of the origins of the classical yoga tradition is the doctors. And again, we don't necessarily think of yogis as doctors or even alchemists, right? But if you go back into history, there's kind of a mix of the two, where people who, if you imagine the earliest period, when people start to realize that certain plants have an effect on you, an almost mysterious to them, very almost magical effect. So suddenly your pharmacist, your physician, becomes like a magician who understands the hidden powers in nature. And what's yogic about it is that they could put them together in the right way and create this perfect balance and harmony. Some of the language that you find in the early Ayurvedic texts, like the Charaka Samhita, actually uses the same terms as texts like the Yoga Sutras and the Upanishads. So we see they share ideas about what it is to comprehend, grasp the forces of nature. Samgraha is the Sanskrit, grasp together the forces of nature and control them in a constructive and beneficial way. You also, of course, get the classic image of the sage or the liberated person, who in the early Upanishads, it talks about the liberated person slipping up through the sky and out through the sun into the world beyond this world. Right, so you get those who want to escape, moksha in the sense of a freedom from all worldly things. And you also get in some places the notion that a king can be a yogi, that yoga is part of kingship, even politics. Again, yogis as doctors, yogis as politicians, this seems really bizarre as philosophers, but actually the notion of the king is one who is supposed to be like the doctor, like the physician. Like the philosopher, they see everything, they understand how to use what they see, and they create something beautiful with greater harmony. And of course, that fits in a way into the idea that Ishvara is often seen as a yogi in a way, the great, in the Bhagavad Gita, the kind of Mahamaya the great yogi, the Antaryaman, who was able to constantly, by his focus, see the world, control the world, and create it as it's supposed to be. So what we have in the history of yoga is many different strands coming together. And in some ways, they're very different and diverse, the sources, whether it's the warrior ascetic, the Cation who's almost shamanic in his flying with the gods, the philosophers, the doctors, the sages, the kings. And there's lots of different texts. And you know that, but you get bits of yoga in the Upanishads, bits of yoga in the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, bits of yoga in the Bhagavad Gita. Obviously, people often go to a classical yoga to the Yoga Sutras. But even beyond that, if you look at parts of, as I said, Ayurvedic texts, I was just reading the Natya Shastra, the basis of Indian arts, rasa theory. There are elements of yogic language and terminology and ideas even there. And of course, all through later concepts of the divine, Ramanuja and many other thinkers. So we have a big picture suddenly of yoga, not just as what the Yoga Sutras say. And all my students were going to Waterstones or wherever and buying the Yoga Sutras and reading it carefully. But I realized after a while they were only getting one picture. So that leads us to this question: what is the goal of yoga? And this is the moment when I'm going to stop for a moment and I want to look at some of your own answers to this question. So if we were in a room together, I could say to everybody, tell me what you think, and people could put their hands up and we'd all have a big debate about it. But just to check in. So we've got moksha. I think that's the classic one. Like that's the ultimate goal for most people of what yoga is ultimately aimed at. So achieving liberation. But we also get some others here. Spiritual enlightenment, that's right. But also I see love is one of them. I think this is really interesting. It's really important that yoga has actually, for many Hindus in their lives, it's about increasing our ability to love and to love more deeply, to become almost made of love and to focus love on what you care about most, often God. Another person to attain peace in daily life, right? So actually, it's not necessarily about getting beyond the world. For some people, it's about being in the world and being peaceful, union and harmony, harmonizing your life, uniting all the different parts of it, right? That sense that we live very fragmented lives. Understanding the Atman, the internal self. So that's a classic Upanishadic view, and I think also yogic, that you go back within and you start to see who you really are. Purifying the mind to make way for realization. That's a lovely way to put it, so that you're in a sense pushing away all these distractions to get back to the focus. I like the union of Batman. I'm not sure what that one means, but I think that was supposed to be Atman. Someone has written the union of Batman, but I think they mean Atman, the union of the self. I was like, I think Batman could be somewhere in the, no, okay, the Atman is, however. So that sense that of the union of the Atman with, often in the Upanishads, clearly it's the union of Atman with Brahman. It's your route to the divine. And famously, of course, that route goes inward rather than necessarily just outward. With Paramatman, we've got there exactly. Liberation from material entanglement, reaching a kind of transcendence which helps being a better person and helping others. Yeah, good. So that sense that we're, again, I always think of kind of taking the dustpan and brush and brushing away all the dust and all the junk that is cluttering our minds and stopping us from acting in the right way. Reconnecting with the Atma, connecting to yourself. Good. So in a sense, this is exactly, I think, what I wanted to hear. Lots of different ideas coming out here that show us a kind of a shared picture overall of what yoga is for. And I think I just want to, I'm going to reshare my screen now. I just want to agree with that, and also maybe look at some of the ways that that comes out in the tradition, and maybe look at some of the implications people don't always talk about. So I'm going to look at some of the examples, and this is from the Hymn of the Cations, Rigveda 10:136. You can look this up if you Google it. This whole text will come up with all the other Rigvedic, the beautiful kind of poems that come from this ancient set of texts. Actually, the world's oldest living, arguably the world's oldest living set of texts. And we've got this wonderful verse that describes the Cations. I just want to read this because it's such a great piece, and we don't know who these people really were. They're referred to as the Munis, they're referred to as the Cations, But who were they, and were they yogis, right? What do you think? Yes or no? It begins, he with the long, loose locks supports Agni and moisture, heaven and earth, so the elements. He is all sky to look upon. That means he's not wearing any clothes. He with long hair is called this light. So long-haired, naked man. The Munis, girdled with the wind, wear garments soiled of yellow hue. So there's also a group who wear these yellow clothes. Interesting that this is so old, but it is the classic Indian idea that yellow actually signals someone who has chosen a religious path. They, following the wind's swift course, go where the gods have gone before. Transported with our Munihood, some sort of sagehood, we have pressed on into the winds. You, therefore, mortal men, behold our natural bodies and no more. They already have this idea that your body doesn't show the real you. The Muni made associate in the holy work of every god, so there's many gods and they're part of their work. Looking upon all varied forms, flies through the region of the air. The steed of Vata, that's the air, Vayu's friend, the wind. The Muni is impelled by the gods. In both the oceans, he has his home, in eastern and in western sea. That's really interesting because this is a long time ago. We're talking, 1000 BC. People didn't travel much, but whoever is writing this has traveled a lot. They've been all the way across India, from the Arabian Ocean to the Bay of Bengal, presumably. And it goes on, treading the path of sylvan beasts, Gandharvas and Apsarases, so male and female spirits. He with long locks who knows the wish is a sweet and most delighted friend. Vayu, the wind, hath churned for him he poundeth things most hard to bend. That sounds mysterious, but actually it's a reference to the pounding of the stalks of a certain plant we no longer have in India, so that out of it came a whitish liquid that if you drank it, it filled you with energy, right? It was called soma. So actually it's saying the wind itself has given you soma drink, this energizing soma drink. And when he with his long loose locks, his long hair, hath drunk, with Rudra, Shiva, water from the cup, the idea is that he then has this enormous energy and power to fly with the gods themselves. This is perhaps the oldest reference to yogis. And it's kind of fascinating because there's no, is there Atman here? Well, in a way there is. The natural body is not the whole self. There is another self, but this is a self that treads the path of beasts and spirits. It flies with the gods. It's part of their work. It flies on the winds, and it's a friend of all, and it has this incredible power. And it also is kind of the wild man with his long hair. He's naked, or else he's wearing these yellow garments, and he supports the elements of fire, water, heaven, and earth. I think this is an amazing text. I really love this piece of writing. And that's an important sense that some of the earliest schools of yoga were not just about going back into the self, they're about doing things with the self, being part of a divine world. And yet, interestingly, if we go on about 1,000, maybe 800 years later to the Katha Upanishad, we see something different happening. Katha Upanishad is one very, very ancient text, influential in the Bhagavad Gita, actually influential on a lot of later writers, Walt Whitman and Thoreau, so many people who read the Bhagavad Gita throughout history and other cultures as well. A lot of what they're reading is actually the philosophy of the Katha Upanishad. The Gita quotes it quite often. But the Katha Upanishad is interesting because it's written at around the time that Buddhism and Jainism were becoming popular. One of the things Buddhism had done had drawn attention to the problem of suffering in life. So there's a real concern that actually all very well to fly around in the forests with the gods, but what about people who now were living in cities? Urban life had started in India. What about what urban life always involves, which is suffering, which is poverty, which is disease, which is difficulty? So the Katha Upanishad talks about what it means to control the self and do yoga as a way of saving yourself from suffering. It has the famous image, know the self as a rider in a chariot and the body as simply the chariot. Know the intellect as simply the charioteer and the mind as simply the reins. The senses, they say, are the horses, and sense objects are the paths around him. Think of horses running off and going crazy and trying to pull you here and there. But he who is linked to the self, senses, and the mind, the wise proclaim as one who enjoys. Now that's a difficult passage, but what it means here by linked is the word yuj, from which the word yoga comes in Sanskrit. Yuj is linked to the English word yoke, he who yokes the senses, the self, the mind, he who harnesses them, he who gets them under control is the man who can really enjoy the world. And it tells us when a man lacks understanding and his mind is never controlled, his senses do not obey him, as bad horses a charioteer. You know what? There's exactly the same image of the soul in Plato, in Plato's text, the Phaedo. He also says the body is a crazy chariot, your senses are pulling you along. Use your mind to control yourself and go where you want to go. And that's what it says. But when a man has understanding and his mind is ever controlled, his senses do obey him, as good horses obey a charioteer. Right? And there's more to that, but I'll stop there. This image is so important, the notion of control. So what we get in these ancient texts is a notion that yoga can be used for a kind of heightening yourself, accessing your inner secret, invisible, non-physical self, maybe just the mind, right? Maybe the spirit, maybe the heart, but so that you can access the divine world and so that you can control yourself in whatever world you find yourself in. What I want to suggest is that yoga starts off not with any single one goal in all the different sources and different traditions and schools, but one single method. It wants to help you learn to craft who you are as a soul, wants to help you control what we might call the mechanics of the mind. So what do the Yoga Sutras say? If we go to the kind of classical text, so by the time you get to around 300 BC, all the different schools of philosophy are writing down their philosophies, and they put them often into sutras or karakas, right? So you've got a Vaisheshika Sutra, a Nyaya Sutra, a Vedanta Sutra, and you've got famously a Yoga Sutra. And that's the text really where people tried to put together the ideas in a clear, straightforward way. So this is from the Yoga Sutras, and it tends to say one of the main goals of yoga is nirodha, a kind of ceasing and focusing of the mind, right? Rodha, rod in Sanskrit is linked to the word roll in English. Nirod is to stop something rolling. It's the not rolling, the non-rolling of the mind. And the image here is that the mind is kind of like a wheel that just keeps going round and round and round and round. But we need to learn to stop it. And if you've ever tried meditation, you know that. You know that to meditate even for 30 seconds, especially if you're not practiced, is really hard. The mind will roll off without you, and suddenly those horses have taken you somewhere you didn't want to be. So the first lines of the Yoga Sutras is the first verse is Atta Yoga Anushasana. So now we have instruction in yoga. And the next lines are these. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. So yoga is chitta, consciousness, vritti, turning, nirodha, not turning, right? So yoga is the not turning of the turning or movement of consciousness. It's the stopping, the stilling of that wheel. Tada, then, drashtu, the seer, from Sanskrit dresh, to see, the seer, swarupa avasthanam. Sta is linked to the word stand in English. Avastha is to stand on or be grounded in. Swarupa is your own form. So if you can stop the mind from turning, then the seer, who you really are, will be avastha, grounded in its own form, its own nature. Your consciousness won't be shaped like tonight's dinner or your worries about work or your concern about family, those things passing through your mind. It will be grounded in the nature of consciousness itself. And it warns us, vritti sarupyam itaratra. Itaratra, otherwise, sarupyam, it will have the form, vritti, of the turnings. If you don't focus your mind will just become basically shaped as all the different thoughts passing through it. So actually, it's really important to take control. Otherwise, let's say I'm worried about work and I'm worried about dinner tonight. I will be nothing but work and dinner tonight, right? That's what becomes me. The Yoga Sutras share a kind of Indian idea from the time that what you focus on, what you think about, is effectively what you become. So that the warning is really important. Think about, take control of what you think about, because that's what you are, right? And people will use that for different purposes. Different philosophers in later Indian thought, Shankara in his Advaita Vedanta, Vijnana Bhikshu in his Veda Vedanta, Jiva Goswami in his Bhakti Vedanta, all of them, the later philosophers say, we're going to use this ability to take our minds and focus them, and we're going to use them for different things. Whatever we want to become, that's what we better focus on. So yoga's sort of technology for taking care of the self, for making us be who we want to be, is really about getting control of the reins of the chariot, harnessing them, right? And that's through something which he calls pratyahara, withdrawal, dhritti, which is stability, and focus, which is dhyana. And the image they use is with a turtle withdrawing its limbs. I love this. They're beautiful metaphors and images to help Indian philosophy make sense to us. Pratyahara, it says, is like a turtle who sees that something's wrong and he says, let's go back to the beginning, get safe. And he withdraws his limbs inward. And now he's within himself. Yoga says the first thing, classical yoga says the first thing we do is do that. This is the technique. And we get rid of, as you guys were kind of saying in your suggestions, pulling away from all the distractions, pull away from dinner tonight, pull away from work, pull away from our worry about that family member who we love, but actually worrying about them is making us less focused. Pull away from it all and go within. And it talks about pratyaks, chetana, adigama, pratyak, perception and consciousness, adigama, going inward. And it uses this term drih, to stand and hold, dhritti, dharana, and di, to focus, imagine, fix something in your mind. Stand and focus your mind on what you want it to have in it. Right, so that's where we get these terms in Sanskrit. Pratyahara, dhritti, dharana, dhyana is the term that actually from which the word Zen comes, the term for total focus. And it says, be careful of all these other things: sickness, apathy, doubt, carelessness, laziness, hedonism, delusion, lack of progress, inconstancy. All these things are distractions, which by stirring up your consciousness, act as barriers to stillness, right? And you may be used to that idea in yoga, in all kinds of meditation, that we're like a pool. And if you look into it and you see a clear image, you splash it about, and then you can't see anything. And the sea is rough and you can barely travel across the sea at all, right? So we want to still the mind. Now this, and is already familiar, I think, from most yoga. And one of the interesting things about it is it fits with contemporary neurology. It fits with even what science says about the nature of the mind. One of the things that recent neurologists have started to understand about the way that we think is that there's a really important function of the brain that is called selective attention, right? This is the filter that the mind, to some extent every living thing, applies to all the wide field of stimuli which are affecting it at each moment. So at every moment, you are being affected by feelings in your body, by different forces from the physical world, by different ideas, by different sounds and senses. Every moment of your life, you're constantly taking in all these different stimulus. That's actually true for all living things. Even a tree is just constantly wind, temperature, moisture, all these different forces, etc. So each living thing actually does the work of taking in, but it also has to filter it, because you can't just respond to everything at once, you go crazy, right? So our minds, even our bodies, all function as things that start to isolate the important bits, filter and focus. Notice that that's what your mind is doing all the time. In essence, this is the data sorting that our minds do at each moment. And one interesting thing that neurologists have noticed, but that yoga noticed about 3,000 years earlier, was that introspection, looking inward instead of outward, helps us to increase our control over that process. There's something called interoception. Every time you stop and instead of looking outwards, think about what you're feeling in your body, that's called interoception, not perception outward, but interoception inward. So when you think, oh, do my toes itch? I'm not sure. If you think about it, they will itch. But that's interoception. And interoception actually involves something called proprioception. So you take as your property certain things. That means that at certain times, you'll suddenly take your hands. Most of the times we don't think about it, but let's say a pianist propriocepts their hands. This is what I'm focusing on now, and puts all their mind control into that. And suddenly they can do with their hands, and they're thinking with their hands, amazing things. What this means is actually we can kind of change what we propriocept, what we focus on, what we attend to, continuously shapes your own mind. The more you focus, the more the filtering in your mind starts to focus its own filter on that. So you are shaping yourself at every moment by the things you give your attention to. It's that old idea that, it's not just that you're reading or drinking or listening or eating or chatting. All of those things aren't just you doing it. It's those things shaping who you are. We're being sculpted at each moment. So the mind is plastic, as they say. We can direct it. That also means, in a positive sense, we can curate it. We can, like artists, we can basically take control and decide what we want the mind to be. So this is really the kind of culminating, in a sense, and what this implies for how we can understand yoga. Yoga isn't just about one thing that we do with the mind. It's not just about focusing. It's not just necessarily about elevating the self or getting control, or even just about loving. It's about the tool that gives you the ability to decide what you want to do, whatever it is that you want to do. That's why yoga is such an immensely precious tool. In fact, in a way, it's one of the most precious tools that any culture has really developed. And it's kind of cool because it's a tool you don't have to buy. It's immensely democratic and everyone has access to it. But it does take a lot of work. One of the things that I just want to bring out about this notion of yoga is that it can be used in the ancient texts tell us it can be used not just for looking inward, but also for looking outward as well, right? Like, this is what I found when I came across some of the ancient texts that I didn't expect. So in the Mahabharata, there's a character called Shuka. You guys probably, many people have heard of him. Some people won't have heard of him. He's kind of a side character. The Mahabharata is a big story about two warring families, and the Bhagavad Gita is in the middle, and there's princes and sages and generals, big characters. But along the way, stories are told about much smaller characters, and often stories about wise people who mastered the art of yoga, particularly if you look at book 12 of the Mahabharata called the Shanti Parvan. There's a whole section in the Moksha Dharma about different people who have become yogically elevated and liberated. In fact, it's like a series of living liberated people. The story of Shuka is one of the most amazing of them. In fact, he's almost the only character in the Mahabharata who is described as being, he's in a way described as being higher and more immediately and fully liberated than any other character, right? So he turns up in the Mahabharata. He's also stories told in the Devi Bhagavata Purana and the Skanda Purana. So these are later kind of 500 CE-ish texts. And Shuka the story is he's the son of a great sage, Vyasa. Vyasa is the great sage who tells many of the stories of Hinduism. Vyasa is born already pretty enlightened, actually, already naturally yogically adept. But Shuka, his son, surpasses him. He's a natural born sage who's innately ascetic. He can recite the Vedas from the moment he's born. And the story is that he's also got a complete and utter control of himself. He's never in his life, even from birth, been subject to passions he does not want. He is wholly who he wants to be. In the story, he's often sent off to be taught by the great philosopher king of the age. So every culture has its great ancient kings who are good and wise. And one of the great ancient kings that turns up in the Upanishads, in the Mahabharata, and other texts as well, is King Janaka. He's kind of the philosopher king. I'm trying to think of characters who are great wise kings, kind of the King Arthur of ancient India in a way. So he goes to Janaka, learns all there is to know, And one of the things he asks Janaka is whether he should go through the normal stages of life. Should he get married? Should he, do all these things, go get a job? And there are different versions of this story. I'll be interested to hear what people have to say about that. But in one version, King Janaka says, oh, yes, you should get married and get a job. And Shuka says, I'm totally not doing that. And Janaka says, oh, you're right. You're completely liberated. You don't need to. In a different story, we get a slightly different version, right, which I'll come to. But in all the versions of the story, Shuka, and there he is sitting on the bench, and he's often portrayed as completely naked because he's beyond any kind of social, normal, conventional way of being. And there he is explaining to Janaka, actually, what the highest truths of yoga are. At the end of the story, he always attains moksha, liberation, and leaves this world. But one of the interesting things about him is that before he leaves this world, he flies through it, right? Think back to that phrase in the Hymn of Vacations. They fly up into the air beyond their natural body, and they fly with the gods. As a Jivan Mukta, a living liberated person, Shuka takes a moment before he slips away into moksha to go and fly and explore the world. His name, Shuka, means parrot, and he's able to fly, sometimes even depicted as a parrot. And in some versions, he actually does take time to live a life with a family and children, sons and daughters, and be part of the community. That's in the Devi Bhagavata Purana. So that there's a version, both agree that Shuka wants to take time to live and explore the world in its highest form, right? And then finally, once he's explored all of it and understood all of it, then he abandons the four worlds. He gives up all the elements, the strands that compose matter, and all the forms of darkness, of energy, and of goodness, and free from all material existence, dwelling in ultimate reality, he then is elevated into the pure form of being, like a blazing fire without any smoke. Shuka is interesting because he reminds us that the ultimate yogi and the ultimate goals of liberation can involve a kind of exploration, discovery, of the world, as well as an escape beyond it. In fact, there's a book called Spiritual Titanism by Nicholas Gear, where he looks at different versions of this. And he talks about Shuka and says, every culture has ideas of people who use their spiritual power to be able to attain the highest possibilities in the world in a noble, completely enlightened, very wise and understanding way, where they're not just, it's the opposite of the hedonist who just has lots of fun. It's the person who goes in a completely aware way into every part of life and explores and understands and does what he truly thinks to be of value with all of it. One more example of this other way of looking at the uses of yoga that also involves wise King Janaka and also comes from book 12 of the Mahabharata. So this, my favorite story, possibly in the whole of these ancient texts, is the story of Sulaba, who was a female yogi, which is already quite rock star. So Sulaba, the female yogi, is in, I think, book 12, chapter 308, I think it is. And the story goes like this, right? And Sulaba is a beautiful young woman who was the daughter of a sage who lived in the forest practicing yoga. So she, in a way, like Shuka, has been brought up from birth in practices of yoga. And she's achieved all the greatest powers, as we see. She hears that good King Janaka has achieved liberation, and she goes off to test him. Interesting, in some stories about Janaka, he's the ultimate wise man. But in this story, he actually needs a few lessons that he's going to get from this woman. She knows that he'll be impressed by beauty, so she transforms herself into a beautiful woman. And when she turns up at the court, he says, "What is this woman doing here without a man? Where is her husband? Who does she belong to?" And she says, "The self cannot belong to anyone. Good king, let me explain to you the true nature of the self." And what she actually effectively tells him is that he has become too focused on the body. He's lost his yogic ability to understand what it really is to be a person. And she tries to encourage him to become what you might call an egoless king, one who actually just sees himself as made out of, as ultimately beholden to those whom he governs. I kind of love this idea as a political idea. She basically says to him, you are really made out of your community. You don't have control over them. You are them. And she uses the language that comes from the Yoga Sutras and the old ancient yogic texts and talks about how he should learn to understand this. So I'm going to put a bit of the text there. She says, a king, she's saying this to him there, a king is always dependent on others while he has to coordinate everything. For how can there be any independence for a king who is absorbed in the business of peace and war? When he gives commands to others, he's said to be independent, but when the command is carried out, he then becomes subject to the factors of the people that he's commanded. So you say, oh, go army, go, and you feel like you're in control. But the truth is, you have to cooperate, and actually, they're the ones who are in control. In many ways, you have to kind of, what's the right way to put it? You have to cooperate with them. Right? We can see that in the Sanskrit below, paratantra sada. Paratantra means your powers are dependent on others, sada, always. Samdhi vigraha yoga. Yoga consists in grasping and pulling together all the different forces and factors that you're linked to, right? So it isn't about being above, it's actually about being linked with the world, but in a responsible and clear-minded way. And I won't go into a long sense of this, but she carries on and she criticizes really his way of doing politics. She says, this is mine, you think, with regard to this city and this territory. But whose are these power, wealth, and ministers of state? In fact, to whom do they not belong, O king? Is there anyone to whom they do not belong? An ally, a minister, a city, territory, punishment, treasury, and monarch, all these different parts that make up the state, they combine into a seven-spoked wheel. A wheel is important because you can't take out one of the spokes, it needs all of them equally. This is what is referred to as sovereignty of those king, O king. Which of these seven parts could have a higher quality when like three sticks standing together, each of them exists in a state of close dependence on the others. Each part in its time will dominate. Whichever achieves its proper function attains precedence at that particular time. So it's like saying you're always linked to all these parts of the world, of your mind, of your body, of the self. The right thing to do is to know that you actually should be trying to grasp and control them in a harmonious, a balanced way, and with a clear focus on what you want to do, and what you want to achieve, not just for you, but for the whole, for the harmonious one whole self that you really are. So really in the end, I want to say, what is the goal of yoga? We see a whole range of different things. It can be samadhi, the immersed consciousness that is completely still and controlled. It can be siddhis, which means powers, the powers and bodily forces that we can increase. Shuka can fly because, in the ancient texts, they believe he can fly because he is able to actually achieve a kind of a higher intensification of his natural bodily powers. Kind of links to the doctor idea, the Ayurvedic idea, that we can, if we increase our powers, if we really focus, we can do extraordinary things. It could be in some of the ancient schools, the Pashupati yogis, they want to become like God, almost become a kind of a mirror image of God, become Shiva themselves. It could be in bhakti yoga, love, right? And this is one of the most important developments in Hinduism, that ultimately, the Western philosophers always thought that rational focus, Plato, is about reason, never about emotion. But Hinduism understands that emotion is one of the most powerful forces we have. It's actually part of dhyana, part of focus. As David Haberman says in one of his most important books on bhakti yoga, he says Hinduism greatly values the tremendous power of emotions. Intense emotions such as passion produce an intense concentration on the object of the emotions, drawing subject and object together. Passion, therefore, is held to be a highly valuable instrument for spiritual endeavor. Right? Passion, if it controls you, is a disaster. You can't think about anything you want to think about. Passion, if you control it, is what you give to those you love, or the work you love, or the hope or the goal, or just the art or the thing that you really most care about. Passion allows you to become filled with the thing that really matters most to you. So in a way, yoga's great gift is that it gives us control and allows us artistry. We're able to become artists. right? The tools that we use are focus, understanding, kind of egolessness, right? We focus our minds, we can understand all the different aspects of our thoughts, our life, our experience. We can get rid of the ego part of ourselves, where we're just concerned about fear or desire. Or we can even expand the ego part of ourselves so that we're actually trying to identify with our family or community in a more meaningful way. We can get free from the influences we don't want, right? That came up a lot in the suggestions you guys made, that one of the things that yoga does is allow us to push away all those vrittis, all those little movements and turnings and ripples that distract us. We can gain control. And once we have control, we can cultivate a kind of devoted commitment to all that we care about, to God or to saving our country in the Bhagavad Gita. And we can intensify that commitment. We can help enjoy the world better, or we can help pour ourselves more deeply into what we really want to achieve. And there's so many goals that could be. It could be dharma, it could be knowledge and exploration of the world, it could be different powers and capacities, purity of the consciousness, immersing ourselves in God, devotion and commitment to things, life with God, life kind of as a mirror of God, life as part of the community, both in the world and beyond the world. All these goals are open to us, but it's yoga that gives us the great gift of being able to choose for ourselves. So in a way, I gave a talk to some scholars in New York, Wonders of Online Work. It's almost like a Lego view of the self, right? If you look at the Ayurvedic texts, the Natya Shastra, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, a lot of these ancient sources from around 300 BC to 300 sort of AD or CE, they talk about the self as almost like lots of building blocks. The really good, clever kid is able to build them up into something wonderful. If you're not really focusing, you can build it into a messy thing that falls apart. But you can build something that actually is fabulous. And they apply that kind of, they don't speak of Lego, but that sense of like building blocks together and pulling them together into something great. They apply that to being a physician. It's like taking the different elements of the body and balancing them right, finding the right ingredients and things to fix it, bring it into harmony. They apply it to being an artist, right? So think of yourself as an artwork. And you can think of yourself as trying to sculpt the perfect person or the best person you can be, rather than just letting yourself accidentally turn into this or that. And it also, I think it's interesting, it applies it to the notion of almost what a politician should be as well. And ideally in ancient Hinduism, the politician is a yogi who doesn't let ego get in the way, very important, doesn't get distracted, very important, and understands that he's always actually about connecting to and sort of in a harmonious way, bringing creative, constructive control to the different parts of the community and of the country. So basically, ultimately, last slide, I really want to say back to the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2, verse 50, yoga is karma sukaushalam. Karma, action, or karma comes from the Sanskrit verb kri, which is linked to the English word to create. So yoga is creating, acting or creating, and it's doing it in a way which is kaushalam, which means wise, which means with a kind of skill, actually is what the word means, with a kind of artistry that means that we really are making what we care about and what we most think is of value for ourselves, for our immediate community and family, or for the world at large. So I'm going to stop sharing now, come back onto the screen, and hopefully we see that we've got this a picture of yoga that is much larger in a way than just one particular goal. It's the tool that allows us to create the artwork of our lives that we most really want to see, that we most really want to be. I'm going to leave it there, but that's my view of yoga. Thank you.
Hello, Jessica. This is Nitin, and I just want to say I just couldn't say wow, wow, wow so many times, and I'm sure everybody wants to give a hand to the breadth of the variety of ways of perspectives that you've shown us about yoga. So can I ask everybody to sort of make sure that they post their reactions in this digital manner of this amazing talk? There are some questions that have been put on the chat. I wonder whether you can actually sort of look through them. There are not that many, and see whether you can answer those. There's one by Ravi to everyone, and Manjula. Perhaps you can answer those.
Yeah, I can answer the first one while people are thinking if there's anything in particular they want to comment or want to add. I think so. Ravi said, I'm a little confused. I always thought yoga began with Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. Is he not behind what we understand as yoga today? The Yoga Sutras are the most famous source. And as I said, they start around the time that Buddhism is also starting. And they're incredibly important. And you go to Waterstones and ask about yoga, and they'll give you the Yoga Sutras. And they're beautiful. They're simple. They're actually, the Yoga Sutras were written to condense all the already existing knowledge into something that was a manual. Sutra is it means a thread. It's something that will just help you follow the thread to achieve a certain thing, right? Sutra links to the English word suture, a thread that helps to bind things together. But actually before Patanjali, already, if you think the Caitians are yogis, you can see what you think about that. The Caitians in some ways sounded yogic, in some ways they didn't sound yogic. So you can decide what you think about it, right? But if certainly in the Katha Upanishad, parts of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the Mundaka Upanishad has a lot of yogic practice in it. Actually, the Gita uses it, and all of that channels in to the Yoga Sutras, which come later. So the answer is, even before the Yoga Sutras, there is at least 500 years worth of thinking about meditation, about how to control the body. So ascetic practices, things like focus, breath work, sitting in a certain way, fasting. All of those ideas are coming together to create yoga in the Yoga Sutras. So that's one. There's also, I think, a question from Manjula.
Yes.
But that's a hard one to answer. I can see you there, Heather. Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, you guys are in an interesting time, right? The yoga has this long history that combines different strands, comes together in the Yoga Sutras, but then spreads. The Yoga Sutras are like the trunk, and it becomes focused, but then the branches spread out again in many directions. And actually now, because it's gone global, it's almost become something for everybody. So you can find, Raja Yoga, which is really good at harmonizing the whole self and the body and the lifestyle and creating that kind of balance and union. But you can also find other kinds of yoga, which are more focused on, for instance, pinpointing consciousness, like Zen yoga, for instance, is really good at forcing your mind to become completely pinpointed and still. Or I spend a lot of time in Thailand where there's a huge tradition of Vipassana yoga. That's where they just sit for many, many hours. In fact, Buddhist monks go underground and sit in caves, like 50 meters down, and total sensory deprivation, so that they completely can kill all distractions of the mind, right? And so in some ways, there are many different traditions. You can also, of course, find hot yoga. You can find, super body fitness yoga, whether that's the same part of the same tradition. I'm not really sure how I feel about that, but there's so many kinds. You, I think, have to find the one that suits what you want to become, right? I guess that's part of the message, is thinking in terms of the artistry of the self. Different yogas will give you different effects. I think so Yogesh asks, why is yoga not part of the Indian academic curriculum? Well, that's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, a couple of different traditions and schools and cultures. I don't know if anyone here has been to a school that used yoga or meditation, but some have tried, and then it's sometimes controversial. People have argued that it would be so good to teach children from an early age to have this kind of focus and control, right? In a world where kids are often constantly being distracted by so many different things, maybe it would be healthy to train people early on to have that capacity to focus if they want to. I have a friend whose husband is a pianist, and they have a baby who's 1 year old, and every morning he has to practice for 3 hours. They got in the habit of putting the baby in front of the piano, and he practices. And interestingly, the baby's now used to just listening. The baby just sits there without a word and just watches for 3 hours. I wouldn't believe it. No one in my family was like this. We were disastrous children, right? But they've trained their child to have this kind of focus on art, actually. She can see any artwork and just be really interested at that age. So maybe something about training people early on would be really healthy. Not that we can't start late, or at least I hope that's true for me. And I think there's another one, so sorry for late question. Are Western countries misunderstanding yoga? There seems to be so many types of yoga these days. Yeah, I'd be interested to hear, ideally, I want to hear what you guys think about it, whether the current ways of being really excited about yoga are getting it wrong or getting it right. Anyone, the ones I can see, if you want to nod or shake your head, whether current yoga is kind of doing the right thing, it's interesting to think about in a way. I mean, I think the ideas that I've been saying, in some ways contemporary, just most people are doing yoga to get fabulous bodies, I think, in England today, right? The huge popularity of it, huge lucrative industry. And people are so excited that their abdominal muscles are going to look good when they put on the bikini. It's not for me to tell it's wrong. And actually, one of the good things about Hinduism, it doesn't tend to say, this is just wrong. It says, well, you can do that if you want. But there are higher goals. And if you only do that, you're only ever going to really get that reward. But you'll never be Shuka flying around the world to discover and see what the possibilities are. So yeah, I think that it is yoga, but it's not the highest use of yoga, let's say. I think someone's put their hand up, but I don't know if we can hear them. You might have to write it into the chat box, unfortunately. I think the way it works, but we'll see about that. I'll just read the next question. So to follow up Ravi's question, I have the impression that yoga and meditation are often instrumentalized in the West and maybe also in India, and that the aim of people is far away from the original goal of yoga. Yeah, in some ways, I think that, to be completely honest with you, that worries me. As a lecturer, my students who come to now study Hinduism, which is far too few. Almost all the students want to study Buddhism. It's more fashionable at the moment. And the mindfulness app has let people know that Buddhism will make you calm. So that yoga will make you fit, Buddhism will make you calm. These kind of cliches exist, I think, at the moment in popular culture. And something about that seems like such a sad limitation of the possibilities. And sometimes I have to say to my student, this I have to say to many people, this is not originally meant to get you some cool lifestyle extra. This is meant for you to be able to elevate your life to an altogether higher way of being. You can use it for the other stuff, but I mean, ultimately, you're missing the whole original goal: to fly around the world, understand all of reality, to see who you are, to harness your potential, and to go beyond the world to something higher. And students kind of go, really? I never thought of that. So I do think that there's a sense in which people are sometimes forgetting what could be the original goal and just looking at it as a kind of another cool cream, another cool app that can make life a little more fun. Another question. So a theory is that at one time young men warriors followed a sacralized horse as it wandered for a year, subjugating the people they came across. At the end of the year, the horse was sacrificed. Over time, these young men left behind warriorship and became sannyasis. How does this fit into yoga's history, if it does? That's an interesting question, actually. So the Rigveda, I read you the hymn of the Cations, was actually about doing rituals in ancient India. Most of it describes rituals. And one of the most important rituals in the Vedic world of the Brahmins then was that if a king was challenged, he instead, if he didn't want to just go to war, he had to do a ritual, the Ashwamedha. And there would be a horse, his best horse in the stables. He would sort of identify himself with the horse with a special ritual, and wherever the horse then wandered around into any land that the horse went, and the men had to follow it to see where it went, the king owned that land. So it was a way for the king to assert his sovereignty and control. And at the end of the time, they would sacrifice the horse, but it was a kind of sacred sacrifice, a way of elevating it, that they understood as a way of elevating the horse to a higher plane. And I've never heard the idea that those men became sannyasis. Maybe that's true. I don't know. Certainly, it's interesting that the old ritual of like showing your control over the land by using this ritual does get replaced with a new idea that, like King Janaka, you should actually have control from your own self. So maybe there's a historical connection. So very sweet. And then we've got, there's two more, and I'll do the second one and then the other one. So is yoga dualistic or non-dualistic? Oh, that's a good question. Some would say yoga is about, basically there are both, right? So I mentioned different schools of thought. Advaita Vedanta of Shankara would say it's non-dualistic. You do yoga to get beyond the changing world and to get back to the one reality in yourself, which is Brahman. But 200 years later, Ramanuja would say, no, it's dualistic. You do it to understand who you are and be able to focus on God. So even within Hinduism, there are varying views. Right? There isn't any one use. And actually, it's one of the things that's cool about Hinduism is that other countries around the world, if they disagreed, they just go kill each other. Whereas in India, they said, oh, okay, it's a different path. That's interesting. We can have a debate about it. We can explore, discuss, but then you had multiple ways of being. So I think it can be both. I don't, tell me guys if I need to stop at a certain point, but I'll keep going. Whereas becoming sannyasis, I first read in Jeffrey Samuels. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I think there is a sense in which, like the Caitians and the Vratyas, some of them seem to have been warriors. And at some point you get a sense that actually better than war, peace and complete focus on the self. Does Agni Yoga have an ancient tradition? I don't know, actually. I don't know of an Agni Yoga. So that might be a 20th century invention, though I don't know it very well, but I've never heard of an older form of yoga called Agni Yoga, fire yoga, I guess. And finally, one of the questions that was put, I think, to me, Jessica, what does yoga mean to you? Yoga means partly a practice I mean to do more often, but don't get around to. I'm still trying to become a more consistent practitioner of yoga because I really need it, both in my mind and my body. But in a deeper sense, over time, I think yoga means to me the potential of the self, the potential of what we can be, that we can go through our whole life without ever touching upon that. A whole life where all we think about is our worries, our plans, but we never stop, focus ourselves, and take the moment to decide what we want our plans to be, right? We just take whatever plans and ideas and goals come to us day by day. You wake up in the morning, I remember what I'm supposed to do today. But maybe we should wake up in the morning, put all of that aside and say, wait, let me focus. Let me still the mind. Let me withdraw from those things. Let me get back into what I really am. Let me think about the possibilities of the world, understand all that's around me. And now let me prepare to take flight and see and become and make what I really want out of life, right? That's to me what yoga is. It's a reminder and a tool to actually do what we really value instead of simply letting the wheel turn without being part of it. I think.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Can you hear me, I assume?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This was incredible, absolutely mind-blowing. I just want to say, just as a wrap-up, that the fact that you said you can sculpt your mind, you can curate your mind through yoga. The mind is plastic, you can shape it, and all those are not just ideas. You can actually influence yourself in that manner. And I just wanted to say one question about a Western philosopher. I think, therefore I am, Descartes. And I've always kind of had a struggle with it, because I suppose the fundamental issue with yoga is the self is different from the body. And whereas, how does that reconcile in Western philosophy?
Yeah, it's a good question. Exactly, in that sense, people have said, is Western modern yoga getting it right? The self is supposed to be different from the body. So we shouldn't be quite so worried about whether the body looks really good at the end of the yoga session. And even your reference to Descartes, for Descartes, the thought is the self. He gets this from Plato, actually. Your thoughts are yourself. But in yoga, it goes deeper than that. Sometimes your thoughts take you away, right? You should take control of your thoughts, make them what you want to be, because really you're what's underneath them. You know, the thoughts are reflecting on to the Purusha or the Atman, to the soul, but the soul itself is something deeper. So that's a really good point, that I think the West focuses on thought and reason and ideas. India focuses on consciousness itself. It's a bit like the difference between the waves you see on the ocean, but the ocean is really that immense, deep reality underneath.
Thank you so much. Can I just ask everybody to look at their reactions and this is just an absolutely incredible talk by Dr. Frazier. Thank you again. I'm just going to ask my colleague Raj Chauhan to sort of say a few words, but before he does that, I want to give everybody this is not just a flavor of OCHS. We are a committed people. A lot of the friends of the Oxford Center of Hindu Studies have had so much pleasure, joy, learning, and amazing individuals. And every time Jessica speaks, you know, I know that the turnout is going to be fantastic. And, you know, this has got this YouTube video that's going to be available to everybody. It's just one part of the OCHS. And I did not realize that you were the editor of the Hindu Journal for the OCHS. And that the OCHS also does a lot of online courses. It's got its own YouTube channel. It's got books of the Bhagavad Gita, the Yoga Sutras. You do incredible amount of research. And for those of you who are here, you might want to consider sponsoring a student or an online course and just becoming a friend. Just become a friend of the OCHS is incredible. So I'm going to pass on to my colleague Raj and Ramila Chauhan, but Raj to do kind of the wrapping up and the end bit, a bit more about the OCHS and how you can support the Oxford Center of Hindu Studies. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Frazer, and I hope to see you again, and we all hope to see you again in another way. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everybody. It's nice to spend a bit of time with you all, even if we weren't quite in the same place. But I hope that you have a wonderful ongoing weekend.
Thank you, Nitin Bhai. Thank you, Dr. Frazier. Absolutely phenomenal, right? And looking at the comments in the chat and on YouTube, amazing. People have already well received it, but I think you'll see as the people also get to view it in their own time, you'll see a lot more encouraging note from people saying how much valuable this is to them. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you. I'd just like to pick up on a couple of things that you mentioned. And my job here as a friends group is to promote the work of the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies and create awareness for all the people globally, where the resources already available to them and people actually don't have the appreciation so far as to how much is available. So with that in mind, if people can scroll back to the on the YouTube channel and look at the slides, each of the slides gives you different information. The online courses are absolutely phenomenal because the amount of people who have actually been on these courses and the feedback that we've received as well. And the amount from what we've gathered in just the last hour, imagine doing a 7 or 8 week course how much one can gain on one simple subject or even a difficult subject. But it is, there are so many different varied courses available, and I encourage people to actually go online and look at whatever subject they'd like to do a course on, possibly available. And that takes me on to the next thing, whereas if it's not available and somebody says, okay, this is really pertinent to me and I'd like you to develop a course. So we've actually got the different levels of sponsorships that I'm asking people to help donate or put money towards. And that's a sponsor online course development. Now, each of these courses that are being delivered, they actually cost in the region of £7,000 to £10,000. But the good thing is your donation would help in developing a course that will be there for eternity, right? And it will be useful for thousands and thousands of people ongoing. So it's a very important, I would say not only important, I think there is a great need for scholars like yourselves who are helping to put these on together. And the more of these courses we have, the better for other people. So please, again, help towards sponsoring those. I'm not asking you to pay 7,000 or 10,000 pounds. I'm saying whatever amount you'd like to pledge towards it, please put that on an email saying what this money is for. And that will go towards raising that money. And our target is to definitely collect enough money for one full development course this year, but maybe lead on to the next one as well. The other thing we collect money for is sponsor a student. Now, as you know, Vidya Dan is one of the greatest dans you can give. Now, the idea is that we actually give that to Shonakaji to give £1,008 to a deserving student who is in need of financial assistance or whatever, because we are not, all of us not rich. And from stories and the letters we've received from past students, this has been an immense help to them because they managed to put their financial issue aside and concentrate more on the study for what they're there for. So please sponsor a student. Now, this is our annual sponsorship, and we collect £1,008 annually, and we give that to a student. The next thing I'd like to talk to you about is to become a friend. Now, people say, what do we friends do? This is what we do. We talk about the OCHS. We get people to help sponsor the work that goes on at the Oxford Center. So please join us, and there's no joining fee, but what we do ask people to do is even donate a small amount on a monthly basis, where that money becomes then a regular thing from you, and it's also a good reminder for yourself that you are actually contributing regularly towards something. It can be just a simple amount like a coffee, cost of a coffee. So we're not looking at large amounts from everyone. The other thing is you can also sponsor one of these talks. Now people say logistically to create a talk like this, even in on Zoom, there are license fees and other costs associated with hosting talks. And we'd like people to say if they would love to sponsor the next talk. And the cost for that is just £200. So that takes some of our admin cost away. So whatever sponsorship money we raise then goes directly to whatever it is sponsored for. So this cost is, and the next one is stay connected, because other than just having these talks, for people who don't know, we do have other events. So please send us your email and stay connected so that you know about our other events. And there are quite a few events now. We're already in the planning throes of at the moment, where there is going to be a yoga retreat, and specifically looking at a 2-day retreat or possibly one. And that's in the system now. So to find out details of our other activities like that, you do need to be on our mailing list, so we can then get to you. And there are different types of events, not just a yoga retreat. There is going to be a Yadanjali, a bhajan event, which is going to be a live event. So these are live events later on this year. So they are in development at the moment. So please do send us your information, and we do need to have it from you rather than taking it just from your email for GDPR reasons. Finally, people who, I think a lot of people say, what is the OCHS? Well, I asked them to go on to the website and see the huge amount of work such a small center is doing. People actually are flabbergasted. So I am trying to invoke a passion, and really I would like them to sincerely feel the passion that all the friends group feel towards the Oxford Center. So that is my job done. So finally, now these talks are actually going on to the YouTube channels, and our last talk attracted 1,400 people have viewed them since our last talk. So the medium is working as well. So please subscribe to the OCHS channel. And the most important thing is as well, if the subject you're not looking for them, do look closely, because our previous talks are also on the YouTube channel now. And they are actually gaining a lot of, even though they are from the past, they are getting a lot of views. One of Dr. Nick Sutton's talk, which we held in Leicester just 3 years ago, has had 40,000 plus people view it. So this is encouraging that we are trying to give them all the information, all the channels, all the mediums for people to access what the real work of the OCHS is and get a flavor of it. So with that in mind, thank you again so much. It was a fascinating talk, right? And thank you for taking the time and really enriching our lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.